The high-level general debate of the 76th session of the United Nations General Assembly concluded this Monday. Representatives of member states called for political solutions to conflicts and also the crisis around the world. The third round of talks between the delegations of the Venezuelan government and the opposition sectors hosted by Mexico concluded on Monday. Palestinian authorities have denounced the latest massacre committed by the Israeli regime, which killed 5 Palestinians in raids carried out in the early hours of Sunday in the West Bank and Jerusalem. From the headquarters of Telesur English in Havana, Cuba, this is From the South. I'm your host, Gladys Quesada. Welcome. The high-level general debate of the 76th session of the United Nations General Assembly concluded on Monday as representatives of member states offered their annual addresses. World leaders and senior officials have spoken for a sixth and final day at the 76th session of the United Nations General Assembly in New York. Monday saw the statements of governmental representatives from Israel, UAE, Yemen, Syria, and North Korea, among others. The annual event, held in a hybrid format due to the coronavirus pandemic, has seen new commitments to meet climate change goals and to address vaccine inequality, as well as a stark warning from UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres of a world on the edge of abyss. Heads of state and government and other representatives have been addressing the General Assembly since last week, expressing their main concerns regarding the challenges ahead, especially in the wake of the COVID-19 pandemic and the ongoing struggle to combat climate change. The 76th General Debate addressed pressing issues affecting the international community, such as the vaccination rollout, preparedness ahead of future health crises, and the rising gap between the rich and poor, developed and developing nations. During his speech as the part of the high-level general debate of the 76th session of the United Nations General Assembly, Syrian Foreign Minister Faisal al-Muqdad recalled the dreadful consequences of the COVID-19 pandemic.
Over the past 2 years, the world has experienced unprecedented circumstances, where hospitals reached full capacity, millions of lives were lost, economies contracted, poverty and hunger soared, cities were into lockdown, curfews were imposed, universities and schools closed their doors, and we grew afraid of approaching one another. All of this because of an invisible virus that continues to evolve and mutate, threatening to claim more lives from all over the world.
The Syrian diplomat also strongly condemned the Israeli attacks on Syria and the ongoing illegal occupation of parts of its territory.
It is totally unacceptable for the United Nations and the international community to continue to fail to enjoin on Israel to implement those resolutions and to cease its systematic and grave violations of international humanitarian and human rights laws. All the while, Israel continues to expand its settlements and support terrorists. It persecutes, discriminates against, and arbitrarily detains Syrians under its occupation, and it plunders the Golan's natural resources and repeatedly violates Syria's sovereignty.
And speaking at the 76th section of the United Nations General Assembly, the Foreign Minister of Grenada, Oliver Joseph, condemned the unilateral and illegal blockade imposed by the United States against Cuba for over 60 years.
Grenada reiterates the counterproductivity of the economic, commercial, and financial embargo imposed by the United States of America against Cuba and the inhumane socio-economic hardship it places on the people of the Republic of Cuba, a country that has provided a wealth of humanitarian assistance around the world, including and during the onslaught of COVID-19, but is nevertheless hindered from participating in the global economy.
The Grenadian Foreign Minister also recalled the disastrous consequences of the pandemic on his nation.
Preliminary estimate showing that the economy contracted by 13.7% in 2020. Stark declines were recorded in several sectors, most notable tourism and air transport. Unemployment rose from a record low of 15.1% in the fourth quarter of 2019 to 28.4% in the second quarter of 2020, with 14,000 jobs being lost as a direct consequence of the pandemic. The socio-economic fallout from the pandemic has been especially severe for vulnerable groups, particularly women, youth, and the unskilled, who are overrepresented in the tourism and informal sectors.
Also, during her speech before the United Nations General Assembly, Foreign Minister of Ivory Coast, Candia Kamizoko Gamora, highlighted the need for equal access to vaccines to overcome the COVID-19 pandemic.
It is undeniable that at this point in the fight against the COVID-19 pandemic, vaccines offer real hope. We must, therefore, step up national initiatives and further strengthen collective action through cooperation and pooling of our resources, as well as guarantee equitable access to the various vaccines to all.
And we'll be right back after this very short break, so don't go away. Welcome back to From the South. More news now. As part of the annual addresses of the United Nations General Assembly, the Foreign Minister of Eritrea, Osman Saleh Mohammed, stated that today's global situation calls for a stronger United Nations.
International agreed development goals combating the growing threat of climate change or responding to the range of threats to international peace and security. The enormity of today's global changes call for a stronger United Nations that is more representative, transparent, and most importantly, effective.
Also, as part of the high-level United Nations General Debate, the Foreign Minister of Sao Tome and Principe, Edith Tenhua, highlighted the importance of the United Nations as an organization that represents hope for millions of people around the world. We continue with other informations. The Foreign Minister also stressed that in order to overcome the economic situation in the most vulnerable countries of Africa, all countries need to embrace and commit to multilateralism and cooperation.
Or delay our responsibility for providing global answers that demand, frankly speaking, the adoption of mainstreamed and collective commitments. The United Nations represent hope for millions of people whose gaze turn to us at this time with the belief that we are on the verge of something new and better for the world.
And the third round of talks between the Venezuelan government and the opposition sectors, hosted by Mexico, concluded this Monday with several agreements reached. Meeting between September 25th and 27th in Mexico City, the parties began discussions on important points of the agreed agenda, including solutions to social, economic, and political challenges. It was agreed to immediately hold several consultation sessions with various national and international political and social actors, so that an efficient consultation and participation mechanism can be set up as soon as possible. The delegations expressed their rejection of the recent acts of xenophobia and violence against Venezuelans in Chile, which represents a serious violation of their rights, and also condemned the hate campaigns against Venezuelans residing in other countries.
Delegations agreed on the need to ensure a gender focus in the development of the talks and negotiations, as well as in the agreements reached, and also proceeded to identify mechanisms for consultation with political and social actors to be as inclusive as possible.
People have mobilized in Chile to reject the acts of xenophobic violence against the Venezuelan asylum seekers in the northern coastal city of Iquique. The local prosecutor has assured that protection measures will be implemented to protect the victims. The prosecutor also called on the police to carry out the necessary investigations to determine those responsible for these violent acts. In addition, means of communication were opened with the victims to identify and determine if there were more people injured, as well as to make a better appraisal of their needs. Meanwhile, the Venezuelan government announced that it will relaunch the Return to the Homeland plan to provide Venezuelan citizens with free flights with the country's flagship airline for their return to Venezuela if they wish so. And the United Nations has also expressed its concern over the violence and xenophobia against Venezuelan migrants and refugees in Chile after a far-right protest against undocumented foreigners in the north of the country saw people burn the belongings of raw sleeping people who had been occupied a public square for months awaiting support. In a tweet, the UN mission in Chile urged the authorities and the population to act within the framework of respect for human rights and the international humanitarian rights. Meanwhile, Dr. Eduardo Stein, Joint Special Representative of the UN Refugee Agency and the International Organization for Migration for Venezuelan refugees and migrants, described the events in Iquique as deplorable and called on political, social, and community leaders to promote coexistence and respect for diversity and the rights of the people. Brazil's far-right president, Jair Bolsonaro, has made it to 1,000 days in office, leading a nation facing a severe political, economic, and social crisis, hard hit by the COVID-19 pandemic and rocked by corruption, and where a large part of the population faces hunger. To celebrate the date, Bolsonaro offered a speech marked by clear references to the October 2nd, 2022 elections, in which he is expected to run for a second term, despite his waning popularity and early polls showing that he is far behind potential rival, former President Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva. Since Bolsonaro took office in January 2019, the former military officer has pursued a neoliberal policy of stripping the poorest sectors of the minimal social protection to benefit the rich, made repeated racist, sexist, homophobic, and other offensive statements, undermined democratic institutions, attacked different branches of the government, promoted deforestation of the Amazon, and overseen the worst COVID-19 outbreak in the world, with a death toll second only to the United States. And we have more stories coming up after this final short break, so stay with us. Welcome back to From the South. Forces of the occupying Israeli regime killed 5 Palestinians in raids carried out in the early hours of Sunday, September 26, in the West Bank and Jerusalem. Palestinian authorities described the move as a massacre and called on the international community to prosecute the perpetrators. We have more details in the following report with our correspondent Hisham Wanos.
Raids carried out in several towns in the northern West Bank and Jerusalem resulted in clashes and shootings that claimed the lives of 5 Palestinians. The Zionist regime in Tel Aviv claims that the operation was aimed at arresting militants of the Palestinian resistance movement, Hamas, who were allegedly planning imminent attacks against Israeli occupation troops.
Que presuntamente planeaban ataques inminentes contra las tropas de la ocupación israelí.
This aggression marks the beginning of a new large-scale violent escalation that is part of a political process by which the Israeli Prime Minister Naftali Bennett wants to make clear his response to Mahmoud Abbas' speech at the United Nations and his one-year ultimatum to complete the withdrawal of Israeli troops from Palestine and the end of the occupation. One of the 5 corpses was escorted to his final resting place, while the remaining 4 were withheld by Israeli troops. The Palestinian National Authority denounced a new massacre, which it warned could lead to an escalation of the situation, especially since Hamas, in addition to promising a forceful response, called on the residents of the West Bank to rise up in support of the resistance against the new Israeli aggression. We denounce that the so-called international community is acting in a biased way in defense of the Israeli entity and against the Palestinian cause, and in this context we criticize that it remains silent in the face of this new aggression that resulted in the martyrdom of several of our Palestinian brothers. This aggression is in revenge for the recent escape of the 5 hero prisoners in an operation called the Road to Al-Quds, and we promise that our response to this crime will be swift, and this response will be strong on the part of all factions and brigades of the Palestinian resistance. Simultaneously, over 600 settlers stormed the Al-Aqsa Mosque in occupied Jerusalem under the protection of Israeli troops, provocative acts that the Palestinian authorities denounce, together with the raids, the executions which, according to UN figures, claimed the lives of 321 Palestinians from January to September the 20th, as well as arbitrary arrests, house demolitions, and the construction of new settlements, predict a serious deterioration of the situation and an unprecedented escalation of tensions in the occupied Palestinian territories.
Hisham, Telesur, Oriente Medio.
Thank you, Hisham, for this report. And now we continue. Palestinian Prime Minister Mohammed Stayeh called for international action for the protection of Palestinians in the face of Israeli oppression and killing as he presided over the weekly cabinet meeting in the West Bank town of Hebron.
Firstly, the Council of Ministers condemns Israel's assassination of 5 Palestinian youth in northern Jerusalem and Jenin, and previously in Beita and everywhere else, and calls for international action for the protection of our people in the face of the Israeli killing machine. The Cabinet affirms its support of President Abu Mazen's speech last Friday before the United Nations General Assembly, in which he affirmed that Palestinians have a right to live in freedom and dignity, and that Israel's disregard of the 1967 borders brings us back to the 1947 partition of the border. The continued diminishing of the geographical base for a Palestinian state brings the conflict over Palestine to square one.
And people took to the streets in Yemen's third largest city of Taiz on Monday to call for the removal of the Saudi-backed coalition government and to protest deteriorating economic and living conditions. At least 7 people were wounded where the security forces of Yemen's internationally recognized Saudi-backed government moved to disperse the protesters. The demonstrations came amid an unprecedented drop in the value of Yemen's currency, the rial. Monday's protests also came some 2 weeks after similar demonstrations in Yemen's southern areas, including the port city of Aden, which serves as an interim capital for the government of President Abed Rabbo Mansour Hadi. Yemen has been wrecked by conflict since a Saudi-led coalition invaded in 2015, backed by the United States to remove the Houthi movement, which had taken control of the capital of Sana'a and much of the northern part of the country, sending Hadi fleeing. Around 80% of the population is reliant on aid, and millions face starvation in what the United Nations says is the world's largest humanitarian crisis. Now we address other topics. A strong earthquake struck the Greek island of Crete early on Monday, killing at least 1 person and injuring nearly a dozen others as panicked residents rushed into the streets seeking safety. The Athens Geodynamic Institute reported that the 5.8 quake struck 23 kilometers northwest of the coastal village of Arvi at a depth of 10 kilometers. Many buildings were damaged and some reduced to piles of rubble from the initial quake and the strong aftershocks. Some 2,500 tents were set up to the house to those who could not safely return to their homes. Local media reported that safety inspections are underway, with members of Greece's disaster response unit flown in with sniffer dogs and specialized rescue equipment. And we have come to the end of this news brief. But remember, you can find this and many other stories on our website at telesurenglish.net. And also, if you feel so inclined, please join us on social media. We are on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and Telegram. For Telesur English, I'm Gladys Quesada. Thank you for watching.